Welcome back to HFO Multifamily MarketWatch, your trusted source for information for apartment owners and investors. Multifamily MarketWatch is presented by Pacific Exteriors Northwest, a contractor specializing in siding and exterior envelopes and delivering exceptional quality and service for over 30 years. And by Gantry Incorporated, the nation's largest independent mortgage banking firm.
Welcome back to HFO Multifamily MarketWatch. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. Today we're with Jennifer Shuch, urban planner, housing, and accessibility advocate with Leland Consulting Group. And I think the original voice of the HFO Multifamily MarketWatch podcast.
Absolutely.
From years ago when you used to work with us at HFO. So thanks for taking the time to come back and visit with us and talk a little bit about housing. Maybe can you give a little history on, what Leland Consulting Group does and what you do as an urban planner and housing and accessibility advocate for that, and then we'll talk a little bit about some specific things in the housing development world in this market.
Sure. Well, Leland Consulting Group is a Portland-based planning consultant firm. We specialize in the market and economic side of planning.
Okay.
And the 6 years I spent at HFO has come in really handy because I'm able to understand the kind of real estate finance aspect of things and understand what the market's been doing for the past several years, where it's going in the future, hopefully, though, that's always a big question mark.
Right.
And we take a kind of place-based approach to both housing and urban planning. So we work on all sorts of things, everything from, a developer or an institutional owner has a site. They are thinking about putting housing on it. We'll help them with some of the financial analysis and public-private partnership side of it. We also work on long-range planning, like comprehensive plans. We'll do the housing and economic development chapters of comprehensive plans for cities, counties, a lot of the time in Washington. I'm working on a study of a transfer of development rights program in Nevada. So it's all sorts of stuff.
All over the West.
Yes, all over the Pacific Northwest, the Mountain West, and the Midwest. So I get to travel now, too, which is exciting.
Oh, that's great. No, I know, because I know that was very important to you. Yes, that was a big part of your life. So you guys don't do like land use, taking it in and get entitlements. It's more about the economic study. Will this project work?
Right. So we do a lot of market analysis, feasibility analysis, and demand analysis for retail and industrial and things like that.
And so you're getting in very early before it's even, does this project make sense or will it make sense? And really trying to project what's going to happen in the future.
Exactly. And for, some of the kind of municipal side of it, the planning we'll talk about how, if you set up your zoning this way, nobody's going to build because this is what the market wants, and you're zoning for 3 stories, the market wants to build 4 stories, and here's why. So we try to bring that perspective in when we work with cities.
Interesting. And so let's talk a little bit about Portland. There's been a lot of change, and we'll talk about zoning and changing, and the one I think the RIP program, the residential infill program, was there to encourage kind of the missing middle housing. It's been around, I think, for, was it 4 years now?
Yeah.
From your standpoint, what would have been the outcome so far since that, and maybe give a little highlight of what that program is.
So residential infill in Portland, it was a huge deal. It took a long time to get passed,
yes,
as you know, but it allows for 4 units on every residential lot, up to 6 if half are affordable. And the kind of first passive RIP was a little bit, it wasn't as flexible as it needed to be. So there was also, in 2022, RIP 2 went into effect, which was kind of an update to increase flexibility. I volunteer with Portland Neighbors Welcome, which is a local grassroots pro-housing, pro-tenant organization, and I wasn't involved with them when they were advocating for RIP, but I was involved when they were advocating for RIP 2. So that's something that I'm kind of a huge nerd about.
Okay.
But some of the flexibility things were things like in RIP, you could have a 6-plex that was affordable, but the affordable housing providers did some surveys and found that people really didn't like the stacked flats option. And so RIP 2 allowed for more kind of townhome style 6-plexes, and just kind of increase the flexibility on land splits and detached duplexes and things like that to create more opportunities for a more affordable homeownership options.
So was the first iteration of the RIP program, after a couple of years, we're able to look at it and say, didn't didn't produce the outcomes we were expecting because of this, and these were the tweaks to it.
Yeah, and one of the big ones was that in the original RIP, there was to discourage kind of, they were calling it at the time McMansions, but
Right.
the idea that they really wanted to have this middle housing. There was FAR bumps for if you went from 1 unit to 2 units and 2 units to 3 units. RIP 2 added one for when you go from 3 units to 4 units. And since then, we've just seen this explosion in fourplexes. And I live in Concordia. There's a ton of new fourplexes in my neighborhood, and all sorts of configurations, like tiny little cottage clusters and like interestingly shaped townhomes. And then the city also created some incentives for when those are sold at an affordable rate to people at 120% AMI. So there's some SDC waivers and tax incentives, and those seem to be in part driving that fourplex production as well. And one of the exciting things about RIP is that it there hasn't been an increase in demolitions, but there hasn't been,
because that was a huge fear when the
exactly
first. I mean, that was the big neighborhood fight of, oh, they're going to tear down all the single family homes, and we're going to build a fourplex or a sixplex in my neighborhood or something like that.
Right, and so what they found in the most recent review is that pre-RIP, when there was roughly the same number of demolitions, when there was a demolition, you'd get less than 2 units per demolished unit. Now it's almost 4.
Okay.
So it is really that fourplexes kind of driving the success of RIP.
Who drove the change to go phase 2? Because I mean, I think that's been a conversation we've had, in our industry with people, is there seems to be a lot of legislation that gets put in place, and then what's the mechanism to say, okay, maybe we need to tweak it here and there. I mean, one thing we've talked, I've talked about it even when you used to work with us was, inclusionary housing and things like that. I mean, why was the residential info program so quick to make? Was it more groundswell of support? I mean, as opposed to some of the other programs that are in place, it doesn't seem like you're always fighting to make the tweaks.
In part, it was actually because the state came out with its own middle housing bill, and so there were a couple really minor changes that needed to happen. So the city was kind of trying to address those minor changes. And then groups like Proud Ground, Habitat for Humanity, Portland Neighbors Welcome, and a few others said, well, while you're opening this back up, maybe you could make these changes because this is what we've heard in the first year or so of this being in effect.
So now it's been in place, and the measurables are much more successful than the first phase.
Right. And some of that, because it was so close, it was just like within about a year of each other. It could be that some of the builders were kind of trying to figure it out for the first year. But it does seem that since RIP 2 went into effect that it's been, much more prolific. Right.
And while coming in during COVID, there was always what was that going to, I mean, we saw it on the larger side, still development was still going even during COVID, but that's kind of changed now. What, for multifamily, for like larger projects, I mean, what do you see, or what changes can be made maybe because right now we're at historic lows for development. So a lot of it has to do with just the economics of it, with where we are with financing costs, where we are with, some of the, deals being sold and transferred below replacement costs. I mean, what do you see in your planning to spur housing? The governor's, wants over 30,000 housing units. A year, that's not going to happen. What would you do if you could sit in that seat and say, here's some tweaks, or maybe here's some policy to look at?
One of the things in Portland that's kind of always bugged me is that the staff that reviews the development permits, their positions are paid for with the fees from development permits. So when development permits drop off, suddenly you have this reduction in staff, and when they start to increase again, you don't have anybody to process those permits. Now, the city of Portland's not in great financial shape right now. That money would have to come from somewhere. But I think that that's something that, we've heard some of the city council members that just got elected saying they want, a shot clock on permitting. I think a lot of developers would be really excited if they knew that permitting was within a certain, much shorter time frame. But the problem is that staffing level, and I think that needs to get solved. Another thing, which I'm actually working on with Portland Neighbors Welcome, is there is a lack of land in Portland in the places where people want to live, where there's infrastructure that's available for real multifamily housing. We've had this centers and corridor strategies where, there's one main road, your Hawthorne, your Belmont.
Division.
Exactly, where you can build apartments, and then everything between them is just the lowest density. And you can look actually at the most recent RIP study. There's a map of where has middle housing been built, and there's this big gap in the middle of the city, and it's because the land values are so high, it doesn't make sense to build a fourplex. Right. You want to build a 4 or 5 story apartment building there, but you can't. So I think that there is a need to change the way the city thinks about zoning and maybe modify that centers and corridors strategy to really free up that land, because if you can't reduce construction costs and you can't reduce the interest rates on your own, land is really the thing that you can have some control over.
And SDC charges and things like that. But like you said, with the system of supporting the staffing by fees, it's kind of a what comes first, chicken or the egg? Exactly. We need fees to come in. And the other thing I've heard, which was interesting, I didn't realize this, talking to some other developers, even on the single family side, the amount of people that have left the staffing department. So you just had a lot of institutional knowledge walk out the door.
Exactly.
So you've got a lot of new people in there, and it's a much, I've heard in places that historically were easier to develop than others, and they're saying that it's tough everywhere because of inexperience on the staffing side, which is taking longer. So we can say all this we want about Salem, but on the grounds, it's not happening in terms of speed.
Right. And I think that right now, the economic challenges are really paramount. I'm working on a project up in Vancouver, Washington, and, the developers we've spoken to about that site are telling us, well, we could do affordable housing because at least with affordable housing, there's subsidies, So I think it is with the economics of development right now are really challenging.
And then for your when you're dealing with municipalities and talking about a program that's in place and maybe the unintended consequences weren't, is there a reception to that maybe we need to tweak that? Has that gotten better? When you and I work together a lot, when you're at HFO, there was kind of feel like we're banging our head against the wall, but is that tone changed a little bit from some of the elected officials?
Yeah, I don't, in my day job, I don't work a lot in Portland specifically. Right. I work a lot in Washington and other places, and I think one thing that I've found is really helpful, especially working in Washington, is sometimes when there's that reluctance, it can be helpful to say, well, the state is requiring you to do this.
And coming from the top, pushing it down.
Right. And I think the Oregon Housing Needs Assessment, which right now they're working on rulemaking for that, I think that that's going to help because it's going to put some teeth to it where, you can go into communities and say, okay, well, the state is telling you that you need to hit these production goals and the state is telling you need to make these changes. And that kind of, you get that grumbling acceptance. People don't like being told what to do, but at least they're like, okay, well, we have to, there's nothing we can do about it. And I think that that's, in a lot of ways, the role the state can play.
Well, I've always talked about, I would tell people on even I remember when we were talking about the RIP program, when you had single family homeowners, all yelling that they're going to have their houses torn down and like, that's not going to happen. But just the reluctance for people wanting to have development in their neighborhood. And how do you get over that? At some point, I think there's a federal government involved and go from the federal government to the state to the local to say, if you don't have these production goals, we're going to hold back funding or something. Because if not, the local here in Oregon, I think we're famous for letting, neighborhood associations have a huge voice in that. But, is the voice for the good of the whole, or is it just for this little 2-block area or 4-block area, which does, I think, impede the ability to get any development done?
Yeah, and I think what's exciting to see is like when I worked at HFO, and I was starting to follow all this stuff in 2016, 2017.
So we had a positive effect on your career.
Right.
I feel good about that.
A huge positive effect.
There we go.
There was a lot of, I think, the conversation around what to do about housing and zoning and all that was very niche, and there was like a handful of advocates for more housing and a ton of people coming out to meetings and saying like, not in my backyard. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that conversation in 2025 is a lot different. People have changed a little bit, and when we were going out and trying to get Inner East Side for All included in the housing production strategy, we went and we talked to neighborhood associations. Not all of them were friendly, but we were able to get the Southeast Coalition of Neighborhoods to sign on because there was this understanding of, okay, this is a good place for housing. We do want to support our local businesses. We do want to have, people to take advantage of the fact that you don't need a car to live here, that you can take transit or bike. And I think that conversation is really changing, and I'm really happy about
Well,
it.
that's good. No, I think you feel it now. I think but it just takes a while. It takes a while to kind of bring it along. So, in talking about some of the Portland stuff, I know you don't is like the inclusionary zoning. I mean, what is your take on that? That's been in place in terms of maybe things they could have done to adjust it, or looking at it now, making it more, maybe as we say, more a carrot, less a stick. I mean, what is your take, from a consulting side on that?
Yeah, inclusionary zoning, it comes up a lot in the work that I do. A lot of communities are interested in it. And I think the interest comes from both the understanding that, mixed income housing is a good for society reasons, but also that it doesn't theoretically cost the city very much. In Portland, it is in part funded by that 10-year tax break. I think one of the challenges with inclusionary zoning is that it went into effect in 2017 in Portland. And in 2017, the market did not look like it does today. And
nothing looks like.
Right.
Everything is substantially changed.
And there's really no way for, you can say, okay, we'll calibrate this every 5 years or whatever, but you don't know when exactly those inflection points in the market are going to be. So you're always playing catch up a little bit. And I think, there was that report in 2024 from BAE Economics that was saying that in the center city, where there's the 10-year tax abatement for all of the units and the rents are a little bit higher, inclusionary zoning isn't having too much of a negative effect. But the way it's done in the rest of the city, where the tax break is only for the affordable units and the rents aren't as high as in the center city, it's having a negative effect on housing production. And I think that Washington just passed a bill that has, it's a 20-year tax abatement, and it's only near major transit stations and things like that. I think there are things that the city could do to...
And doesn't their affordability component stay with the 20 years? Whereas then Portland
Yes.
did you got the tax break, but then you
year.
got the 99 years, which was just, I'm not sure where that number came,
Right. So I think it's very hard to calibrate inclusionary zoning programs. I think the goal of them is really, really good. Mixed income housing, mixed income neighborhoods, I'm 100% for. I don't really know what it would take to make a truly successful inclusionary zoning program, because you'd have to be able to get ahead of where the market's going, and nobody can do that.
Right. And right now, there's so much volatility in all fronts that trying to plan where we're going to be in 2 years is really tough.
And rents right now aren't doing what they were in 2017. We had huge rent increases in 2017, which is not good for renters, right? And, it is better to have, from a renter perspective, to have, smaller increases, but that means that inclusionary zoning makes development more challenging in an already challenging environment.
Which makes it, are there in your work, are there municipalities or places that have been more successful in fostering development? Again, I know it's a tough time looking at it now because of the environment, but in just, I think, policies that have been in place, maybe they haven't got the bear of all the fruit of that yet. But then where you look at it and say, hey, here's a model that maybe other cities or municipalities could look at for how to spur development.
Yeah, I think right now it's challenging in most places. I think there's a shift towards form-based codes that is going to be helpful. I know it hasn't gone into effect yet, but again, Vancouver, Washington, they're changing their zoning code with their comprehensive plan update right now. And they really want to move towards a more form-based codes where they're allowing, higher heights, a wider mix of uses, just kind of making it streamlined in that way. And I think that seems to be where things are going in the planning world right now, is give people the flexibility to do what the market wants to do, right?
Not so
there's
strict.
a lot that's zoned for retail, and the retail market is doing what retail market is doing. So, making it so that you can change those uses without a change in zoning is, I think,
more
really
flexibility
important.
On the zoning to be able to get through the process.
Right.
Okay. And then what about, we'll bring this, you and I have talked, we did white papers on it together, rent control.
Okay.
And as I always talk to people about, don't look at Oregon or Portland as a thing for rent control because of, it's not so much the number. I think if we said to, our clients, hey, if you had this rent number annually, I think everybody'd be happy. I think the fear has been the perception that every 2 years we're sitting there negotiating, what that level is. What is your kind of take on rent control?
I think most of what I've read about rent control, and typically like stricter rent controls than we have in Oregon right now, is that it does have a negative impact both on supply and also the ability of people to move. So you have, people staying in the same like 2 or 3 bedroom unit when they could be going to a 1 bedroom unit.
And opening up that 2 and 3 for families. And
I think, I'm more interested in some of the concepts around social housing than I am in rent control, where, there's some public housing that allows people to live within their means, and there's not that fear of the rent going up beyond what you can pay. Because I think that with rent control, depending on what you're paying for rent and what your income is, even if it's like a 4 or 5% increase, that can be a lot, for a tenant. So I think if we're talking about stability, I favor things like social housing over rent control.
Okay. And then what do you see from, for like housing, I think the state's got a program is with the Housing Infrastructure Production Fund. I mean, my concern is our state talks a lot about doing these things but then there becomes a question of appropriations and where the money comes from.
Right.
And so it's, we can talk about doing all this, but if there's no appropriations and you're putting it on the back of the housing developer or the rental housing provider, again, it just factors into the cost and makes it more expensive to develop.
I think actually one of the things I'm really excited about in the state legislature right now is SB 684, which is the mixed income revolving loan fund. It's going to require appropriations of seed money, but over time, it becomes a self-sustaining program because it's a loan. And I think that one of the great things about that is that in this environment where we're hearing from developers, like, maybe I could build housing if the interest rate was, that I could get was 4%, but it's 6% and I can't build the housing. This is an opportunity to have these really low or no interest loans to fill those gaps. And I think that that's the kind of thing that, there's that upfront outlay, but then over time, right, people are paying back into it, and you can build more housing that way. I think that I'm really excited about.
Is there another city that's done that or state that's done that?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I know that Housing Oregon, which represents the affordable housing providers, they've been fighting for that for a really long time. And I'm not sure what the model was that they used for that. And
then I know you talked about doing a lot of studies on the public-private partnerships, which we've seen more and more of that. Talk a little bit about that, how that's changed and what you see moving forward with. Are we going to see more public-private partnerships in trying to address some of the housing supply issues?
Yeah, I think so. I think something that's become really popular across cities and states nationwide is the idea of using public land for housing. A lot of cities and states have surplus public land. They can give that land away for free or reduced cost and help with development feasibility. Unfortunately, the development environment is so rough right now that free land in a lot of cases isn't even cutting it. But, if that's combined with maybe some, infrastructure investments by whatever public agency owns that land, there's ways to kind of make that work. And I think that there's going to be, school districts and transportation agencies and just, different kinds of agencies that are going to be looking at their land and saying, we've had this since 1950 when we were going to build a highway that never got built.
What are we doing with this?
Right. Maybe housing can go here. And so I think that is a big trend in housing development.
But to get that, you've got to work with, in terms of changing the zoning or getting more flexible zoning to do that. Because if it was originally put in and brought in for like you said, a freeway expansion or an off ramp or something, maybe the zoning doesn't correlate with housing.
Yeah. And I think, as I work on comprehensive plans, especially in Washington, I see cities trying to get ahead of that. They'll say like, okay, well, we have this, big piece of land over here. Let's make sure that that's, in our land use map, that's going to be residential or commercial or mixed use or whatever it is. And I think that's, obviously comprehensive plan updates don't happen every day, but I think cities it's on their radar now.
And when you're talking about housing, the other thing that we've talked driving is you also need to have land dedicated for, industrial.
Yes.
I guess we could talk about office, but we won't. So when you're looking at that, when you're talking to municipalities, you're saying, hey, we can talk about housing, but if we don't have jobs behind that, so make sure we carve out. Are they open to that? I mean, we can't just have housing and retail services without, where are people going to work? So is that coming around or?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, especially in states where there's sales tax, the cities want that. They want their commercial areas, they want their auto dealerships, they want all those things. I think in Oregon, there's an understanding that there is a need for jobs and there's a need for places for people to work. And there's, a trend towards those more mixed use neighborhoods. But even in Portland, like the Central East Side Industrial District is still an industrial sanctuary. And that's something that, I've talked to, folks at the CEID about that area and, wouldn't this be a nice place for housing?
Or kind of maybe more flexibility on what the definition of industrial is.
Right.
Which is what they kind of tried to do on some of the redevelopment down there.
Yeah. And so there's that tension of we want to make sure that there's enough spaces so that entrepreneurs, people who are doing creative things, people who are starting companies can do that, but also places for those people to live. So balancing that is important.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down. It's always good to see you. It sounds like your career's doing well, and keep up the good work. I think at the end of the day, as we say to our, everybody wants to have, affordable housing and safe and productive housing. It's just sometimes legislative-wise, they're kind of reaction, and it takes time for these policies to get in place.
Exactly.
And really measure is it working or not working. So I think the work you're doing is very important. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good to see you again.
Good
and we'll
to see
you
you
next time on Multifamily MarketWatch. Thank you. That was great.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information. HFO is a member of Global Real Estate Advisors. Learn more at grea.com.